gaslight flickered against the hospital ward's whitewashed walls, casting dancing shadows across the rows of iron beds. In the suffocating heat of that August night in 1901, Nurse Jane Toppan moved between her patients with practiced grace, her starched uniform whispering against the wooden floors. The scent of carbolic acid hung heavy in the air, mingling with something sweeter, more cloying. Mrs. Gibbs lay propped against her pillows, eyes wide with sudden terror as the morphine coursed through her veins, far more than any healing dose required. Her breath came in shallow gasps, fingers clawing at the thin hospital blanket. The nurse leaned closer, her voice a gentle murmur of false comfort, watching with clinical fascination as life ebbed from her patient's face. In the bed beside, another soul stirred restlessly, unaware that death wore a nurse's cap and spoke in soothing tones. The rain drummed steadily against the windows, drowning out the barely audible sounds of struggle. By dawn, the ward would be quieter by one more voice, and Nurse Toppan would begin her rounds anew, carrying her terrible secret through the corridors of Cambridge Hospital, where healing and harm walked hand in hand. Chapter 1. The Angel of Death in White. Good evening, and welcome. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small. Let us drift backward in time to an era when gaslight flickered against hospital walls, and the practice of healing was still shrouded in mystery and superstition. I am the Bedside Historian, your guide through the darker corridors of our past, where shadows hold secrets and whispered confessions echo through empty halls. Wherever you find yourself listening tonight, perhaps curled beneath familiar blankets or watching rain trace patterns across your window, know that you have joined countless others who seek comfort in the strange solace of historical darkness. What time shows on your clock matters little now, for we travel to a place where time moves differently, where the tick of pocket watches marked not merely hours, but the final heartbeats of the innocent. If this journey into the past brings you peace, I would be honoured if you would consider subscribing to our channel. These stories of forgotten tragedies and buried truths depend upon listeners like you to keep them alive, ensuring that even the darkest chapters of our history are not lost to the silence of forgetting years. Now, let us step across the threshold of memory, into the gaslit streets of Cambridge, Massachusetts, where autumn leaves drifted down upon cobblestones in the year 1885, and where a young woman named Honora Kelly was about to transform herself into something far more sinister than her humble Irish origins might suggest. The Cambridge Training School for Nurses stood like a monument to progress and healing, its red brick facade rising against the grey October sky. Within its walls, young women learned the sacred art of tending to the sick and wounded, their white-starched uniforms marking them as angels of mercy in an age when death visited far too frequently and stayed far too long. The scent of carbolic acid permeated every corridor, mixing with the earthier aromas of lye soap and the perpetual dampness that seemed to cling to the walls of all such institutions. Honora Kelly walked through these halls with the measured steps of one born to service, though the fire that burned behind her pale blue eyes spoke of ambitions that reached far beyond the confines of bedpan and bandage. At 31 years of age, she was older than most of the other students, her face already marked by the subtle lines that betrayed a life of hardship and determination. Her dark hair, pulled back in the severe style demanded by the school's regulations, framed features that might have been called handsome rather than beautiful. A strong jaw, high cheekbones, and those unsettling pale eyes that seemed to see more than they ought. The other students whispered about her in the dormitory after evening prayers, their voices carrying the hushed tones reserved for matters they did not quite understand. There was something different about Honora Kelly, something that set her apart from the farmers' daughters and merchants' girls who made up the majority of their number. She had come from nowhere, it seemed, with no family to visit on Sundays and no letters arriving with the morning post. When pressed about her past, she would smile that peculiar half-smile of hers, and speak vaguely of troubles that had brought her to nursing as a calling rather than a choice. What none of them knew, what none of them could have imagined as they knelt beside their narrow beds in evening prayer, was that Honora Kelly was already dead in all but flesh. The woman who'd been born in that name had perished somewhere in the dark spaces between respectability and ruin, leaving behind only this carefully constructed facade that would soon take on a new identity entirely. For it was during those first weeks of training that Honora began introducing herself to patients and visitors alike as Jane Toppan, claiming the surname of the family who had taken her in as a child. The transformation was subtle at first, a gradual shedding of one skin for another. The Irish accent that had marked her speech began to soften, replaced by the more refined tone she had absorbed during her years of domestic service in proper Boston households. Her posture straightened, her manner became more assured, and that strange intensity in her pale eyes grew sharper, more focused, as if she had finally found the channel through which her peculiar talents might flow. The autumn of 1885 brought with it an early frost that painted the windows of the training school with delicate patterns of ice. In the wards below, patients huddled beneath thin blankets, grateful for any warmth in those days before central heating made hospitals more comfortable for the suffering. It was here, in these dimly lit spaces where pain echoed off bare walls and hope struggled against despair, that Jane Toppan first discovered the intoxicating power that came with holding life and death in her capable hands. Her instructors noted her exceptional dedication from the beginning. While other students hurried through their duties, eager to return to their books or their letters from home, Jane lingered at bedsides, her voice soft and soothing as she adjusted pillows and smoothed blankets. She had an uncanny ability to appear whenever a patient seemed most distressed, materializing at their bedside like a guardian angel summoned by suffering itself. Mrs. Patterson, the head matron, often remarked to the other instructors about Miss Toppan's natural aptitude for the work. The young woman seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of what her patients needed, often anticipating their requests before they could voice them. She moved through the wards with a grace that spoke of genuine calling, her white uniform pristine even at the end of the longest shifts, her dark hair never showing so much as a strand out of place. What Mrs. Patterson and the others could not see, what their rational minds would have refused to comprehend even had they witnessed it directly, was the expression that crossed Jane Toppan's face when she believed herself unobserved. In those unguarded moments, as she stood over a particularly vulnerable patient, or prepared a medication in the dim light of early morning, something shifted in her features. The mask of professional compassion would slip just enough to reveal something far more complex and infinitely more disturbing. The winter months of her training passed like a fever dream, each day blending into the next in an endless succession of lessons and clinical rotations. Jane absorbed everything with the intensity of one who understood that knowledge was power, and power was what she craved above all else. She learned the properties of laudanum and morphine with the same thoroughness she applied to the proper technique for changing bed linens. She studied the symptoms of various ailments with the dedication of a scholar, though her interest seemed to focus particularly on those conditions that might mask the effects of other, more artificial causes. Her fellow students began to notice certain peculiarities in her behaviour as winter gave way to spring. Jane had developed a habit of volunteering for the night shifts, claiming that she found the quiet hours conducive to learning. She would walk the wards in the small hours before dawn, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the wooden floors, checking on patients with a dedication that impressed even the most demanding supervisors. During these nocturnal rounds, Jane discovered that the boundary between healing and harming was far thinner than the textbook suggested. A slight miscalculation in dosage, an extra measure of laudanum added to ease suffering, a gentle hand holding down a pillow just moments longer than necessary. These were the subtle graduations between mercy and murder, and Jane found herself fascinated by the precise calibration required to navigate between them. The first death occurred on a rain-soaked night in April, when the spring storms lashed the windows of the ward with unusual fury. Old Mr. Brennan, admitted for pneumonia, had been struggling for days, his laboured breathing echoing through the ward like a broken bellows. Jane sat beside his bed through the long hours of darkness, her hand resting gently on his fevered brow, whispering words of comfort as his strength ebbed away. When dawn broke grey and cheerless over Cambridge, Mr. Brennan was gone. His passing so peaceful that the day nurse remarked upon it with wonder. Jane accepted the condolences of her instructors with appropriate solemnity, though something in her pale eyes flickered like candlelight in a draught. She had crossed a threshold that night, though none who witnessed her apparent grief could have guessed the true nature of that crossing. The remaining months of her training passed without incident, at least none that anyone could identify as such. Jane continued to excel in her studies, her practical skills advancing with remarkable speed. She demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to be present during the final moments of her patients' lives, offering comfort and dignity to those who faced their last earthly trial. The staff came to depend upon her during the most difficult cases, knowing that Jane Toppan could be trusted to provide the kind of compassionate care that made the difference between a peaceful passing and a tormented struggle. When graduation day arrived in the autumn of 1889, Jane stood among her fellow nurses with the satisfaction of one who had found her true calling. The ceremony was held in the hospital's main hall, with families gathered to witness their daughter's transformation from students into professional healers. Jane had no family present, but she showed no sign of distress at her solitary state. She had become something beyond the need for conventional relationships, something that fed on different sustenance altogether. As the newly graduated nurses received their certificates and pins, Jane's hand closed around her own credentials with a grip that spoke of possession rather than mere achievement. These documents represented more than professional qualification. They were her license to hunt, her passport to a world where she could satisfy the peculiar hungers that had been growing stronger throughout her months of training. The gaslight that had illuminated her studies would continue to flicker in the wards and private homes where Jane Toppan would ply her trade in the years to come. But now those dancing shadows would conceal something far more sinister than mere medical procedures. They would hide the careful preparations of one who had learned to kill with the same precision others used to heal, who had discovered that the ultimate intimacy lay not in saving life, but in the delicate, terrible act of taking it away. As the autumn wind rattled the windows of the graduation hall, Jane Toppan stepped forward into her new profession, carrying with her the skills and knowledge that would make her one of the most prolific killers in American history. The angel of death had donned her white uniform, and the long harvest of souls was about to begin. Tomorrow's dawn would bring new patients, new opportunities, and new victims for the woman who had once been Honora Kelly, but was now something else entirely. Something that wore the face of mercy while harbouring the heart of a predator. Chapter 2. The Making of a Monster. The bells of Boston's Old North Church chimed midnight across the harbour, as young Honora Kelly drew her first breath in the cramped tenement rooms of the Irish Quarter. The year was 1857, and the cobblestones outside ran slick with October rain, washing the grime from doorsteps where immigrant families huddled against the autumn chill. In the narrow confines of that third-floor dwelling, shadows danced against peeling wallpaper, while the infant's cries mingled with the distant sound of ship's bells from the harbour. Her mother, Bridget Kelly, lay exhausted upon the straw-filled mattress, her face pale as the worn linen sheets. The midwife who attended the birth spoke in hushed Gaelic whispers, crossing herself as she cleaned the child with the water from a cracked ceramic basin. Something in the infant's eyes troubled her, a peculiar intensity that seemed to watch and calculate even in those first moments of life. The old woman would later tell neighbours that she'd felt a chill pass through the room, though the coal stove burned steadily in the corner. Peter Kelly stood by the single window, watching the gaslight flicker against the glass panes as rain streaked down like tears. His calloused hands, stained from years of dock work, trembled as he held his pipe. The Irish potato famine had driven his family across the Atlantic only a decade before, and the promise of America still felt fragile in their grasp. Now, Another mouth to feed stretched their meagre resources thinner still. The tenement building groaned and settled around them, its wooden bones creaking with the weight of too many families pressed into too few rooms. The scent of cabbage soup drifted up from the floors below, mingling with the ever-present odour of damp wool and unwashed bodies. Outside, the bells of ships continued their mournful chorus, calling workers to their shifts at the wharves where Kelly earned his daily bread. As the weeks passed, young Honora proved a difficult child. She cried incessantly through the night, her wails echoing through the thin walls until neighbours complained. During the day, she lay unnaturally still, watching everything with those pale eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Bridget often found herself unnerved by the child's stare, crossing herself when she thought no one was looking. The Irish quarter of Boston in those days was a world apart from the stately brownstones of Beacon Hill. Narrow alleys twisted between overcrowded buildings, their surfaces slick with refuse and rainwater. Children played in streets where horses and carts struggled through the mud, their laughter mixing with the calls of vendors selling bread and milk from wooden carts. The smell of coal smoke hung perpetually in the air, darkening the brick facades and settling like a grey veil over everything. When Honora was barely 2 years old, tragedy struck the Kelly household. Bridget fell ill with consumption, her cough growing worse as the harsh Boston winter settled over the city. She spent her final weeks in the charity ward of Massachusetts General Hospital, where the smell of carbolic acid barely masked the stench of disease and death. Young Honora would visit with her father, standing silently beside the iron bed while other children cried and clung to their dying relatives. The child showed no emotion as her mother wasted away, her small frame becoming skeletal beneath the rough hospital blankets. Nurses remarked on the little girl's composure, how she watched the medical procedures with fascination rather than fear. When Bridget finally succumbed to the disease, drawing her last rattling breath as dawn broke over the hospital windows, Honora simply nodded and walked away. Peter Kelly could not manage both work and child-rearing in the unforgiving environment of the immigrant quarter. Within weeks of his wife's death, he made arrangements to place Honora with the Toppan family in Lowell, Massachusetts. The Toppans were a respectable family who had agreed to take in the orphaned child, though the circumstances surrounding this arrangement remained shrouded in whispered conversations and hushed exchanges of money. The journey to Lowell took place on a bitter February morning in 1860. Snow fell steadily as the horse-drawn carriage made its way through the Massachusetts countryside, its wheels cutting deep tracks in the muddy roads. Honora sat perfectly still throughout the journey, her small hands folded in her lap, watching the frozen landscape roll past the frost-covered windows. The driver, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained whiskers, glanced back at the child several times, unsettled by her unnatural quietness. Lowell in 1860 was a city of cotton mills and boarding houses, where the thunder of machinery filled the air from dawn until dusk. The Merrimack River powered countless looms, and young women from across New England came to work in the textile factories. The Toppan family lived in a modest wooden house on a tree-lined street, far removed from the industrial noise that dominated the working quarters of the city. Otis Toppan was a deacon at the local Congregational Church, a man whose reputation for piety and charitable works preceded him throughout the community. His wife, Sarah, had borne no children of her own, and their decision to take in the Irish orphan was seen by many as an act of Christian mercy. The house itself was a stark contrast to the cramped tenement rooms of Boston. Whitewashed walls, polished wooden floors, and windows that let in streams of clean sunlight. The child was rechristened Jane Toppan, her Irish Catholic origins carefully erased, along with any trace of her original surname. The Toppans provided her with new clothing, dark wool dresses with white collars, proper shoes instead of the rough boots she had worn in Boston. They enrolled her in the local school and insisted she attend Sunday services at their church, where the minister's sermons emphasized duty, obedience, and the terrible consequences of moral failing. But beneath the veneer of respectability, something darker festered within the Toppan household. Otis Toppan, despite his public displays of righteousness, proved to be a harsh and unforgiving guardian. His discipline was swift and severe, administered with a leather strap kept hanging in the kitchen pantry. The slightest infraction, a spilled cup of milk, a torn dress, a whispered word during evening prayers, brought immediate punishment. Jane learned to navigate this treacherous environment with cunning that belied her tender years. She discovered that tears and pleas for mercy only made the beatings worse. But that certain expressions, a downcast look, trembling hands, whispered apologies, could sometimes forestall punishment altogether. More importantly, she began to understand the intoxicating power that came from watching others in moments of vulnerability and pain. The other children in the neighbourhood found Jane peculiar and unsettling. She showed little interest in the games and diversions that occupied most young people, preferring instead to watch the adults around her with an intensity that made them uncomfortable. When the local physician came to treat Sarah Toppan's recurring headaches, Jane would find excuses to linger nearby, observing as he administered laudanum drops and noting how the medicine affected her guardian's behaviour. During her school years, Jane proved to be an exceptional student in certain subjects, particularly those involving human anatomy and the properties of various plants and herbs. Her teacher, Miss Abigail Warren, often remarked on the girl's unusual interest in medical texts, though she attributed it to intellectual curiosity rather than anything more sinister. Jane would spend hours in the school's small library, reading every available book on medicine, botany, and natural philosophy. As she grew older, Jane began to experiment with small amounts of various substances: laudanum pilfered from Sarah Toppan's medicine cabinet, digitalis extracted from foxglove flowers in the garden, even small quantities of arsenic obtained from rat poison in the cellar. Her subjects were initially insects and small animals, creatures whose suffering she could observe without drawing attention from the adults around her. The transformation from victim to predator occurred gradually, almost imperceptibly. Each small cruelty built upon the last, each successful deception increasing her confidence. By her 14th birthday, Jane had perfected the art of appearing innocent while harbouring thoughts that would have horrified her guardians. She learned to smile at just the right moments, to shed tears when they would be most effective, to present herself as a model of Christian virtue while planning acts of calculated malice. The turning point came during the winter of 1871, when Sarah Toppan fell gravely ill with what the local physician diagnosed as a severe case of influenza. Jane, now 14 years old, volunteered to serve as her guardian's primary caretaker. She brought meals to the sick room, administered prescribed medications, and sat for hours beside the bed, appearing to all observers as a devoted daughter caring for her ailing mother. But in the privacy of that dimly lit chamber, with snow falling steadily outside the frost-covered windows, Jane began her first serious experiments with human subjects. Small adjustments to medication dosages, additional drops of laudanum administered when no one was watching, careful observations of how different substances affected Sarah's breathing, pulse, and level of consciousness. The woman's suffering became a source of fascination rather than concern. Sarah Toppan's illness stretched on for weeks, her condition fluctuating in ways that baffled the attending physician. Some days she would seem to improve dramatically, sitting up in bed and asking for solid food. Other days she would relapse into semi-consciousness, her breathing laboured and her pulse erratic. Jane maintained her devoted vigil throughout, earning praise from neighbours and church members for her selfless dedication. When Sarah finally recovered, Jane felt a mixture of disappointment and anticipation. The experience had taught her valuable lessons about dosages, timing, and the importance of maintaining absolute secrecy. More importantly, it had revealed the exquisite pleasure that came from holding another person's life in her hands, from being the unseen force that determined whether they lived or died. The seeds of her future career in nursing had been planted during those long weeks at Sarah Toppan's bedside. Jane had discovered that the medical profession offered unparalleled opportunities for someone with her particular interests and inclinations. Nurses were trusted implicitly, given access to powerful medications, and expected to work alone with vulnerable patients during the dark hours of the night, when witnesses were few and explanations came easily. As the bells of Lowell's churches chimed the hour across the snow-covered city, Jane Toppan began to dream of white uniforms and hospital wards, of medicine bottles and patient records, of all the opportunities that awaited a young woman willing to dedicate her life to the healing arts. The path that would lead her to the Cambridge Hospital and beyond had begun to take shape in her mind, though none who knew her could have imagined the darkness that lay hidden beneath her placid exterior. Chapter 3. The Art of Gentle Murder. The autumn of 1887 brought crisp mornings to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where the leaves turned amber and gold along the cobblestone streets leading to Cambridge Hospital. Within those brick walls, Jane Toppan had settled into her role with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally found her calling. The starched white of her nurse's uniform had become a second skin, and the weight of the keys at her belt spoke of responsibility and trust, earned through months of diligent service. The wards hummed with their familiar rhythms. Footsteps echoed down corridors lined with tall windows that let in the pale October light. The scent of carbolic acid mixed with the earthier smells of wool blankets and coal fires burning in the common rooms. Patients spoke in hushed tones, as if the very walls demanded reverence for suffering and healing alike. Within this sanctuary of medicine, Jane moved with increasing confidence, her reputation growing among both colleagues and the families who entrusted their loved ones to her care. Dr. Cornelius Beeman, the chief physician, had noticed her particular dedication to the most difficult cases, where other nurses might hurry through their duties with patients who lingered between life and death. Jane seemed drawn to their bedsides. She would remain long after her shift ended, adjusting pillows, dampening foreheads with cool cloths, and speaking in the gentle tones that seemed to bring comfort to even the most distressed souls. Her colleagues remarked on her unusual devotion, though none questioned the motives behind such seemingly selfless behaviour. The hospital's apothecary occupied a small room on the second floor, its shelves lined with amber bottles containing the tools of healing and relief. Laudanum sat beside bottles of morphine sulfate, while neat rows of mercury preparations shared space with digitalis and strychnine, each substance carefully labelled and measured for its precise therapeutic purpose. The room smelled of bitter herbs and chemical preserves, a sharp contrast to the warmer scents that filled the patient wards below. Jane had begun to spend considerable time in the apothecary, familiarising herself with the various preparations under the guidance of Dr. Beeman. Her interest in pharmacology impressed the physician, who encouraged her questions about dosages and effects. She absorbed every detail with the intensity of a scholar, though her studies extended far beyond the prescribed uses of each medicine. Late in the evening, when the hospital grew quiet, save for the occasional groan from the wards, she would linger among the bottles, turning them in the lamplight as if reading secrets written in their amber depths. The first intentional death came on a November evening when fog rolled in from the Charles River, blanketing Cambridge in a grey silence that muffled even the sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones. Mrs. Amelia Davis had been admitted 3 days earlier with pneumonia, her lungs struggling against the fluid that gathered there like tide pools at dawn. She was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair that lay thin against her pillow, and hands that trembled when she reached for the water glass at her bedside. Jane had volunteered to take the night watch, claiming that Mrs. Davis reminded her of her own dear mother and deserved special attention during her final hours. The other nurses were grateful to be relieved of what they assumed would be a long vigil ending in natural death. Dr. Beeman had left instructions for morphine to ease the woman's breathing, should her distress become too great to bear. The dosage was clearly marked on the chart at the foot of her bed, precise measurements that would bring relief without hastening the inevitable. As midnight approached, Jane sat beside Mrs. Davis in the dim glow of a single oil lamp. The ward was silent except for the laboured breathing of her patient and the distant tick of the corridor clock. Rain began to tap against the tall windows, creating a rhythm that seemed to echo the woman's struggling heartbeat. Mrs. Davis's eyes fluttered open occasionally, searching Jane's face with the desperation of someone seeking anchor in a storm. The morphine bottle felt warm in Jane's palm as she prepared what would appear to be the prescribed dose. The amber liquid caught the lamplight as she drew it into the syringe, though the amount she measured bore no relation to Dr. Beeman's careful instructions. Her hands remained steady as she approached Mrs. Davis, speaking in the same gentle tones that had earned her such trust among patients and colleagues alike. The injection site was prepared with the same meticulous care she had been taught, every motion performed with the precision expected of a trained nurse. Mrs. Davis's breathing grew shallower within minutes of the injection, though this seemed only the natural progression of her illness. Jane pulled her chair closer to the bedside, ostensibly to monitor her patient's condition more carefully. In truth, she found herself studying every subtle change with an intensity that had nothing to do with medical duty. The way Mrs. Davis's fingers gradually relaxed their grip on the bedsheet fascinated her. The increasingly distant look that came into the woman's eyes held her attention completely. When the final breath came, barely a whisper in the quiet ward, Jane felt a satisfaction unlike anything her previous nursing duties had provided. The death was recorded as natural, the result of pneumonia complicated by the patient's advanced age. Dr. Beeman signed the certificate without question, having expected this outcome from the moment Mrs. Davis was admitted. Jane performed all the expected rituals with apparent sorrow, preparing the body with the reverence due to the departed while inwardly marvelling at how simple it had been. No alarms had been raised, no suspicions voiced. Death in a hospital was, after all, as common as the sunrise. Winter deepened around Cambridge Hospital, bringing with it an increase in respiratory ailments and the frailties that cold weather imposed on the elderly. The wards filled with patients whose conditions ranged from minor to grave, providing Jane with ample opportunity to expand her unofficial studies. She had begun to keep careful mental notes of the effects various substances produced, though these observations never found their way into any official record. Mr. Thomas Brennan arrived in January with heart trouble that left him gasping for breath after the slightest exertion. He was a retired blacksmith, his hands still bearing the calluses of his trade, who spoke fondly of the horses he had shod throughout his working life. His wife visited daily, bringing small comforts from home and sitting beside his bed, while they shared quiet conversation about their children and grandchildren. Jane volunteered to oversee his care personally, citing her growing expertise with cardiac cases. The digitalin prescribed for Mr. Brennan's condition required careful measurement, as the difference between a therapeutic dose and a dangerous one was measured in mere drops. Jane studied the physician's instructions with her usual thoroughness, though her interest lay more in understanding the boundaries of the medication than in respecting them. On a February evening when snow fell steadily outside the ward windows, she administered what appeared to be his regular dose, though the actual quantity would have strained even a healthy heart beyond its limits. Mr. Brennan's death was attributed to the progression of his cardiac condition, a conclusion that surprised no one who had witnessed his struggles with even simple activities. His wife wept quietly beside his bed, while Jane offered comfort and support, her voice filled with genuine-sounding sympathy for the woman's loss. The funeral was well attended, as befitted a man who had spent his life in service to his community. Jane attended as well, standing in the back of the church while the minister spoke of God's mercy and the peace that came to those who had lived righteous lives. Spring brought renewal to Cambridge, with flowering trees lining the streets and the promise of warmer days ahead. Within the hospital, Jane's reputation continued to grow. She was increasingly assigned to the most challenging cases, particularly those patients who lingered between recovery and decline. Her colleagues had begun to seek her advice on difficult matters, impressed by her apparent intuition for understanding what troubled souls needed most. Dr. Beeman spoke of recommending her for additional training, perhaps even formal study in the emerging field of psychiatric nursing. The deaths that occurred under Jane's care were noted but never questioned. In an institution where mortality was an expected part of daily reality, the loss of elderly or severely ill patients attracted little scrutiny. The families of the deceased often expressed gratitude for the special attention their loved ones had received during their final days. Cards and letters arrived regularly, thanking Jane for her compassion and dedication during such difficult times. By summer's end, Jane had perfected her methods through careful observation and practice. She had learned to recognize the signs that preceded death, understanding how to time her interventions for maximum effect, while maintaining the appearance of natural decline. The hospital's supply of medications provided everything she needed, while her growing authority as a senior nurse gave her access to treatments that might have been questioned if administered by someone with less standing. Her colleagues never suspected that the very qualities they admired in Jane, her dedication to difficult patients, her willingness to work extra hours with the dying, her apparent ability to bring peace to troubled souls, masked purposes that had nothing to do with healing or comfort. The trust she had earned through months of exemplary service provided the perfect cover for activities that grew bolder with each success. As autumn returned to Cambridge Hospital, painting the leaves outside the ward windows in familiar shades of gold and scarlet, Jane reflected on how much she had learned during her first year of true practice. The lessons had been invaluable, teaching her not just about the mechanics of death, but about the systems and people that could be relied upon to look the other way when faced with outcomes they expected to see. The foundation was now firmly established for work that would extend far beyond the hospital's brick walls, into private homes where families welcomed her expertise and never questioned her methods. Chapter 4. The Art of Gentle Killing. The autumn of 1885 brought a peculiar stillness to the Massachusetts General Hospital Training School, where young women in starched white aprons learned the sacred art of healing beneath gaslit corridors that never quite dispelled the shadows. Among these aspiring angels of mercy walked Honora Kelly, though she had begun calling herself Jane Toppan, with the casual ease of one shedding an unwanted skin. The transformation from foundling to nurse had been carefully orchestrated, each detail polished until it gleamed with respectability. The hospital's training ward occupied the third floor of a granite building that had witnessed decades of human suffering. Its windows faced east, catching the first pale light of dawn as it filtered through the perpetual haze of coal smoke that shrouded Boston. Within these walls, beneath the watchful eyes of stern matrons and weary physicians, Jane discovered something that stirred her soul in ways the scriptures never had. Here, in the presence of death and dying, she found her true calling. The curriculum at Massachusetts General demanded precision. Student nurses learned to fold corners with military sharpness, to measure medicines with exacting care, and to speak in voices that carried comfort without betraying emotion. Jane excelled in every aspect of this training, her movements becoming fluid and purposeful as she navigated between the rows of iron bedsteads that housed Boston's afflicted poor. The supervising nurses noted her dedication in their daily reports, praising her gentle manner with difficult patients and her willingness to take on the most challenging cases. But in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the hospital settled into its deepest rhythm and only the most dedicated remained at their posts, Jane began her true education. The morphine cabinet stood locked behind a panel of frosted glass, its contents carefully catalogued and monitored. Yet Jane possessed a particular talent for observation, noting which keys unlocked, which doors, which supervisors counted their supplies with mathematical precision, and which allowed their attention to wander during the endless rotation of 12-hour shifts. The first time she administered an extra measure of morphine, it was to Mrs. Beaulieu, an elderly French woman whose consumption had reduced her to little more than bones held together by will and habit. The woman lay in the corner bed, her breathing shallow and laboured, her eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the cracked plaster ceiling. Jane had been assigned to her care for 3 consecutive nights, watching as the disease consumed what remained of a life that had already endured too much suffering. On that third night, with rain drumming against the windows and the gas flames flickering in their glass chimneys, Jane made her decision. She prepared the usual dose of morphine, then added just a small amount more. The liquid caught the lamplight as she drew it into the glass syringe, appearing almost golden in the amber glow. Mrs. Beaulieu received the injection with the passive acceptance of one who had grown accustomed to pain, her thin arm barely registering the needle's entry. Jane remained at her bedside, ostensibly checking vital signs and adjusting pillows, but in truth studying the subtle changes that followed. The woman's breathing grew deeper, more regular. The lines of pain that had etched themselves around her eyes began to soften. For perhaps an hour, Mrs. Beaulieu experienced something approaching peace, her body relaxing into the narrow hospital bed, as if she were sinking into the finest feather mattress. Then came the moment Jane had not anticipated, but found herself observing with clinical fascination. The breathing grew shallower, the intervals between each breath stretching longer. Mrs. Beaulieu's eyes remained closed, but her lips moved slightly as if she were carrying on a conversation with someone invisible. Jane leaned closer, her ear almost touching the woman's mouth, catching fragments of whispered French that might have been prayers or simply the final murmurings of a mind releasing its hold on consciousness. The death, when it came, arrived with such gentle quietude that Jane almost missed the precise moment of transition. One breath became the last, with no struggle, no dramatic finale, simply a cessation as natural as sleep. Mrs. Beaulieu's face, which had been carved hollow by months of suffering, now appeared almost youthful, as if death had restored something that illness had stolen away. Jane sat beside the still form for nearly an hour, studying this transformation with the intensity of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript. She noted how the skin took on a different quality, how the features seemed to settle into new arrangements, how the very air around the bed seemed to change its weight and texture. When she finally rose to notify the attending physician, she carried with her a new understanding of her own capabilities and an intoxicating sense of power that no textbook had ever described. The official cause of death was recorded as consumption complicated by respiratory failure. Dr. Whitman, the elderly physician who had overseen Mrs. Beaulieu's care, expressed satisfaction that her final hours had been free from distress. The supervising nurse commended Jane for her attentive care during the woman's last days. No one questioned the slightly elevated morphine usage recorded in the medical logs, attributing it to the natural fluctuations of end-stage palliative care. In the weeks that followed, Jane found herself drawn to the terminal cases with increasing frequency. She volunteered for the night shifts, claiming that she preferred the quieter atmosphere and the opportunity to provide more individualized attention to her patients. Her supervisors viewed this dedication as evidence of exceptional character, unaware that they were witnessing the emergence of something far more complex and dangerous. The second death came 3 weeks later, involving an elderly Irish labourer named Patrick Donovan, whose liver had been destroyed by decades of whiskey and hard living. He had been admitted in the final stages of cirrhosis, his body swollen with retained fluid and his mind wandering between lucidity and delirium. Jane had observed his condition with professional interest, noting how his body struggled to perform even the most basic functions. Mr. Donovan's death followed a similar pattern to Mrs. Beaulieu's, though Jane refined her technique slightly, adjusting both the dosage and timing to achieve what she privately began thinking of as optimal results. She discovered that the key lay not in the quantity of morphine alone, but in understanding each patient's individual physiology and tailoring her approach accordingly. Some required more medication to achieve the desired effect, while others responded dramatically to even small variations from their prescribed doses. The winter months provided Jane with numerous opportunities to practice her evolving skills. The harsh New England cold drove Boston's poorest to seek shelter wherever they could find it, and many arrived at Massachusetts General in advanced stages of pneumonia, tuberculosis, and other ailments that flourished in the tenements and boarding houses. Jane made herself indispensable during this busy season, working double shifts and caring for the most hopeless cases with apparent selflessness. Her technique grew more sophisticated with each application. She learned to vary the injection sites to avoid leaving suspicious patterns of needle marks. She discovered which medications could be mixed with morphine to enhance or mask its effects. Most importantly, she developed an intuitive understanding of how different types of patients responded to her ministrations, allowing her to predict with increasing accuracy the course each death would follow. The psychological component of her activities proved as intoxicating as the technical mastery. Jane found herself studying her patients' faces with microscopic attention, memorizing every nuance of expression as consciousness faded. She began to recognize the precise moment when awareness flickered out, leaving behind only the mechanical processes of her body gradually shutting down. This moment of transition fascinated her beyond any other aspect of her work, representing as it did the ultimate exercise of control over another human being. By spring, Jane had attended the deaths of 17 patients, each one carefully orchestrated to appear natural and merciful. Her reputation within the hospital continued to grow, with senior physicians specifically requesting her services for their most challenging cases. Dr. Whitman began referring to her as his most trusted assistant, praising her ability to provide comfort to the dying and support to their grieving families. The families themselves became another source of study for Jane. She observed how differently people reacted to loss, cataloguing the various expressions of grief as methodically as she had once memorized the symptoms of disease. Some wept openly, their sorrow spilling out in torrents of tears and keening. Others maintained stoic composure, their pain visible only in the tightness around their eyes or the way their hands clenched and unclenched unconsciously. Jane learned to modulate her own responses to match the expectations of each situation. With the openly grieving, she provided gentle comfort and whispered condolences. With the stoic, she offered quiet efficiency and respectful distance. Her ability to read these emotional atmospheres and respond appropriately enhanced her reputation for compassion and professionalism, creating a protective shield of respectability around her increasingly frequent presence at deathbeds. The spring of 1886 marked a subtle shift in Jane's approach. Having mastered the technical aspects of her private practice, she began to explore its emotional dimensions more deeply. She started spending extended periods with patients in their final hours, ostensibly to monitor their condition, but actually to study their responses to the dying process. She became fascinated by the different ways consciousness ebbed away, noting how some patients fought against the approaching darkness, while others seemed to welcome it as a release from suffering. These observations led her to develop what she privately termed her methodology of mercy. She convinced herself that her actions represented a form of compassion, shortening the suffering of those who faced inevitable death, while providing them with a gentler passage from life. This rationalization allowed her to continue her activities without experiencing the moral conflicts that might have troubled a less adaptable conscience. The hospital's mortality rates during this period fell within normal parameters for an institution treating Boston's poorest and sickest residents. Jane's patients died quietly and peacefully, their deaths attributed to the natural progression of their various ailments. No one connected the slight increase in morphine usage to any particular pattern of outcomes, and Jane's careful attention to varying her techniques and timing prevented the emergence of any obvious statistical anomalies. As her graduation from the nursing program approached, Jane began to consider her future with anticipation rather than anxiety. She discovered her true vocation within these hospital walls, developing skills and interests that would shape the remainder of her life. The world beyond Massachusetts General stretched before her like an unexplored territory, filled with opportunities to practice her unique form of healing. The last patient under her care during the training program was a young woman named Sarah Connolly, barely 20 years old and dying of tuberculosis. Jane spent 3 nights at her bedside, watching as the disease consumed lungs that had once sung in the choir at St. Patrick's Cathedral. On the final night, as rain again drummed against the hospital windows and the gas flames flickered in their eternal dance, Jane administered her gentle mercy one last time, studying Sarah's peaceful transition with the satisfied attention of a craftsman admiring particularly fine work. Chapter 5. The Art of Gentle Death. The autumn of 1889 brought with it the crisp promise of change to the cobblestone streets of Cambridge, where the red brick buildings of Massachusetts General Hospital stood like sentinels against the turning season. Within those walls, where the scent of carbolic acid mingled with the earthier odours of human suffering, Jane Toppan had begun to perfect what she would later describe as her greatest work of art. The transformation from student to practitioner had awakened something dormant within her, a terrible flowering of purpose that would bloom unseen for years to come. Her training at Cambridge Hospital had concluded with commendations from the head physician, Dr. Cornelius Beeman, who noted in his final evaluation her remarkable dedication to patient care and her seemingly intuitive understanding of the delicate balance between comfort and cure. What he could not have known as he penned those fateful words with his steel-nibbed fountain pen was that Jane had indeed mastered the balance between life and death, though not in the manner he intended to praise. The gaslight that flickered in the wards each evening illuminated more than the pale faces of the afflicted. It cast dancing shadows that seemed to follow Jane as she moved between the iron bedsteads, her footsteps muffled by the thick wool stockings beneath her practical leather boots. The starched white of her uniform had become a symbol of mercy to those who lay waiting for relief from their ailments. Yet beneath that pristine facade, something far more complex stirred with each passing night. Mrs. Amelia Finney had been admitted on a Tuesday morning in late October, her elderly frame racked with the persistent cough that had plagued her through the damp New England summer. The physician's diagnosis spoke of consumption, though the progression seemed slower than typical cases that found their way to the hospital ward. Her family, prosperous merchants from Beacon Hill, had arranged for private nursing care, and Jane had volunteered for the assignment with an eagerness that impressed her supervisors. The private rooms afforded Jane freedoms that the common wards did not permit. Behind the heavy wooden door with its brass handle polished to mirror brightness, she could attend to her patient without the constant oversight of her colleagues. Mrs. Finney, grateful for the attention, and comforted by Jane's gentle manner, had come to regard her nurse as something approaching salvation itself. It was during those long October nights, when the rain drummed against the tall windows and the gaslight threw wavering patterns across the wallpaper, that Jane began her experimentation in earnest. The hospital's pharmacy held an abundance of medicines, each carefully catalogued and stored in brown glass bottles, with neat paper labels written in the physician's precise script. Morphine sulfate for the management of severe pain, atropine for the regulation of heartbeat, digitalis extracted from the foxglove plant for cases of cardiac weakness. Jane had observed how each substance affected the human form, noting the subtle changes in breathing, the dilation of pupils, the gradual slowing of pulse beneath her fingers as they pressed against wrist or throat. She began to understand that death, when properly orchestrated, could be made to appear as natural as breathing itself. The art lay not in violence or sudden shock, but in the gentle guidance of a soul from one state to another. Mrs. Finney received her evening draught of morphine with gratitude, unaware that the dosage had been carefully adjusted beyond therapeutic necessity. Jane sat beside the bed, her hands folded in her lap, watching with clinical fascination as the older woman's breathing deepened and her eyes grew heavy with artificial sleep. The morphine brought dreams, Jane knew, dreams that made the transition from life to death feel like nothing more than a deeper slumber. When Mrs. Finney passed, in the early hours of November 3rd, the attending physician noted the peaceful nature of her departure and commended Jane for her compassionate care during the final hours. The family wept with gratitude rather than suspicion. and Jane found herself elevated in the estimation of both colleagues and supervisors. Death, she realized, could be a path to professional advancement when properly managed. The success with Mrs. Finney opened new possibilities that Jane explored with the methodical patience of a natural philosopher conducting experiments in her laboratory. Each subsequent patient became an opportunity to refine her technique, to better understand the delicate mechanisms by which life surrendered to death. She learned to recognize the precise moment when struggle ceased and acceptance began, that instant when the body acknowledged defeat and embraced the gentle darkness she offered. Mr. Joshua Gibbs arrived at the hospital in December, his robust frame weakened by what the physicians diagnosed as acute gastritis. A merchant of moderate prosperity, he had worked his entire life in the wool trade, his hands bearing the permanent stains of dyes and his lungs carrying the dust of countless bales. His wife visited daily, bringing small comforts from home, a favourite pipe, a well-worn book of psalms, a knitted scarf that smelled of their hearth. Jane volunteered to serve as his primary nurse, citing her experience with similar cases and her availability for the extended hours such care required. The head nurse, overwhelmed with the demands of the busy winter season, gratefully accepted the arrangement. Mr. Gibbs, for his part, found Jane's presence comforting, her voice soothing during the long nights when pain made sleep impossible. The gastritis provided perfect cover for Jane's ministrations. The symptoms, nausea, cramping, weakness, could easily mask the effects of carefully administered poisons. She began with small doses of arsenic, a substance readily available in the hospital stores for the treatment of certain skin conditions. The metallic compound, tasteless and odourless when properly prepared, could be introduced gradually, allowing the body to weaken naturally while maintaining the appearance of disease progression. Mr. Gibbs lingered for 3 weeks, his condition fluctuating in ways that puzzled the attending physician, but seemed consistent with the unpredictable nature of gastric ailments. Jane maintained meticulous notes, documenting not only his medical care but also her private observations of how each dose affected his constitution. She noted the gradual greying of his complexion, the increasing tremor in his hands, the way his eyes began to sink deeper into their sockets as the arsenic did its subtle work. On the night of December 20th, as snow began to fall beyond the hospital windows, Jane prepared what she intended as Mr. P. Gibbs's final dose. The arsenic was supplemented with a carefully measured amount of morphine, enough to ease any discomfort while ensuring that the end would come peacefully. She sat beside his bed as the combination took effect, watching as his breathing grew shallow and his pulse weakened beneath her practiced fingers. Mr. Gibbs died as the church bells chimed midnight, welcoming the winter solstice with his final breath. Jane closed his eyes with gentle fingers and arranged his hands upon his chest before calling for the physician. The death certificate listed acute gastritis as the cause, and his widow thanked Jane through her tears for the kindness shown during her husband's final days. Winter deepened around Cambridge Hospital, bringing with it a steady stream of patients suffering from the seasonal ailments that plagued New England communities. Pneumonia, influenza, and various fevers filled the wards, providing Jane with ample opportunities to practice her developing craft. She learned to vary her methods, sometimes employing morphine alone, other times combining it with atropine or digitalis to create different presentations of natural death. Her reputation as a dedicated and skilled nurse continued to grow. Patients specifically requested her care, drawn by reports of her gentle manner and the peaceful deaths of those under her supervision. Physicians praised her intuitive understanding of patient needs and her ability to provide comfort during the most difficult passages from life to death. The hospital administration, pleased with the positive reports from patients and families, began to consider her for advancement within the nursing hierarchy. Jane found deep satisfaction in her work, a sense of purpose that had eluded her throughout her troubled youth. Each death represented not destruction but transformation, a carefully orchestrated passage from suffering to peace. She began to see herself as an artist of sorts, creating masterpieces not in oil or marble, but in the delicate choreography of final moments. The morphine dreams she induced, the gentle slowing of heartbeat and breath, the peaceful expressions that settled upon faces in death, these became her medium and her message. As winter gave way to the tentative promise of spring, Jane's confidence in her abilities grew stronger. She had learned to read the signs of approaching investigation, to recognize when families might question the circumstances of death, and to adjust her methods accordingly. The hospital environment provided perfect cover for her activities, the natural occurrence of death among the sick and elderly, creating an atmosphere where her interventions passed unnoticed. The snow began to melt from the hospital grounds in March, revealing the first green shoots of grass beneath the bare branches of the elm trees that lined the walkways. Jane stood at the window of the ward, watching as carriages moved along the cobblestone streets and pedestrians hurried past wrapped in heavy coats against the lingering cold. Spring would bring new patients, new opportunities to refine her craft, and new challenges to overcome. She had discovered her calling within these walls, among the gaslight and carbolic acid, between the iron beds where suffering souls sought relief from their earthly burdens. Jane Toppan, the nurse who had found purpose in providing the ultimate comfort, prepared to continue her work as the seasons turned and the wheel of life and death spun onward through another year. The chapter of her education was complete, but the greater work lay ahead, waiting in the warming air of Massachusetts spring. Chapter 6. The Art of Gentle Murder. The autumn of 1889 brought with it a peculiar tranquillity to Cambridge Hospital, where the maple trees shed their crimson leaves like drops of blood against the granite steps. Within the hospital's corridors, a different kind of transformation was taking place, one that would forever alter the nature of healing within those hallowed walls. Jane Toppan had settled into her role with the quiet efficiency of a spider spinning its web, each thread placed with meticulous care and deadly purpose. The hospital itself stood as a monument to modern medical advancement, its brick facade rising 4 stories against the Massachusetts sky. Gas lamps flickered in the evening hours, casting their yellow glow through tall windows that looked out upon the Charles River. The building's interior bore the distinctive scent of carbolic acid and fresh linen, punctuated by the softer notes of laudanum and chloroform that drifted from the surgical wards. It was here, among the sick and dying, that Jane Toppan would perfect her most sinister craft. Her fellow nurses regarded her with a mixture of admiration and puzzlement. There was something unsettling about the way she lingered beside certain patients, her pale hands smoothing their blankets with unnecessary tenderness. The head nurse, Mrs. Margaret Whitman, had noticed how Jane volunteered for the night shifts, particularly those involving the most critically ill patients. When questioned about her dedication, Jane would simply smile and speak of her calling to ease suffering wherever she found it. The morphine arrived in small brown bottles, each one carefully measured and recorded in the hospital's ledgers. The attending physicians trusted their nurses to administer the prescribed dosages, a trust that Jane exploited with the patience of a natural predator. She had learned to calculate the precise amounts needed to achieve her desired effects, studying the subtle differences between therapeutic relief and something far more permanent. Her knowledge of anatomy, gained through her nursing training, allowed her to understand exactly how the human body would respond to various combinations of drugs. Mrs. Elizabeth Connors became Jane's first hospital victim on a cold November evening, when the wind rattled the window panes and sent shivers through the ward. The elderly woman had been admitted for pneumonia, her lungs filled with fluid and her breathing laboured. The prescribed treatment called for small doses of morphine to ease her discomfort, but Jane saw an opportunity for something more elaborate. She prepared a syringe with nearly 4 times the recommended amount, her hands steady as she approached the bed where Mrs. Connors lay sleeping. The injection itself was administered with professional competence, the needle sliding beneath the skin with barely a whisper of discomfort. Jane remained beside the bed, watching as the morphine began its work. Mrs. Connor's breathing grew shallow, then irregular, her pulse weakening with each passing minute. When the elderly woman's eyes fluttered open in confusion and growing panic, Jane leaned close, her voice a gentle murmur of false reassurance. She held the woman's hand as consciousness faded, studying the subtle changes in her patient's face with the fascination of a natural philosopher observing a particularly interesting specimen. The death was recorded as a natural progression of pneumonia, complicated by the patient's advanced age and weakened condition. The attending physician signed the death certificate without question, trusting in the professional competence of his nursing staff. Mrs. Connors was buried in a simple pine coffin at Mount Auburn Cemetery, her passing mourned by no one except a distant nephew who had not seen her in several years. Jane's second hospital victim followed within the month, a middle-aged man named Thomas Brennan who had been admitted for surgery on a hernia that had become strangulated. The operation had been successful, but the patient's recovery was complicated by his tendency to complain loudly about the quality of his care. Jane volunteered to tend him during the night hours, claiming that his complaints disturbed the other patients and required special attention. The combination of morphine and atropine proved particularly effective in this case, the two substances working together to suppress both breathing and heart function while creating a peaceful expression that suggested natural causes. Jane administered the fatal dose through Brennan's evening medication, mixing the drugs with his prescribed laudanum in proportions that would prove lethal within hours. She remained at his bedside throughout the night, occasionally adjusting his position or smoothing his hair, all while monitoring the gradual cessation of vital signs. By morning, Thomas Brennan lay still and pale, his hands folded peacefully across his chest, as if he had simply drifted away in his sleep. The attending physician attributed the death to post-surgical complications, possibly an embolism or heart failure brought on by the stress of the operation. Jane assisted with preparing the body for burial, her movements efficient and respectful, betraying nothing of the satisfaction that burned within her chest like a carefully tended flame. The pattern established itself with ruthless efficiency over the following months. Jane selected her victims with the careful consideration of a connoisseur choosing fine wine, preferring patients who were already gravely ill or elderly, those whose deaths would raise no suspicions among the medical staff. She varied her methods, sometimes using pure morphine, other times combining it with digitalis or strychnine in doses too small to be detected, but sufficient to achieve her purposes. Her technique evolved with each killing, becoming more sophisticated as she learned to read the subtle signs that preceded death. She discovered that certain combinations of drugs could produce symptoms that mimicked natural disease processes, making her murders virtually undetectable to the medical knowledge of the time. A carefully measured dose of aconitine could simulate heart failure, while digitalis in excess could create the appearance of a stroke or sudden cardiac episode. The winter of 1890 brought with it a particularly vulnerable patient in the form of Mrs. Sarah McKinnell, a widow in her 70s who had been admitted for treatment of a gastric obstruction. The woman's condition was serious, but not immediately life-threatening, making her an ideal candidate for Jane's attentions. Over the course of several nights, Jane administered increasingly large doses of morphine, each injection bringing Mrs. McKinnell closer to the edge of consciousness, while maintaining the appearance of therapeutic treatment. The old woman's death occurred on a particularly cold February morning, when frost covered the hospital windows like intricate lace patterns. Jane had remained with her throughout the final night, ostensibly monitoring her condition, but actually savouring the slow progression toward death. She held Mrs. McKinnell's hand as the morphine claimed its final victim, feeling the gradual cooling of flesh and the cessation of pulse beneath her fingertips. The funeral was attended by a handful of elderly women from Mrs. McKinnell's parish, their black-clad figures moving like shadows through the snowy cemetery. Jane did not attend, but she watched from the hospital's upper windows as the simple procession made its way past the building toward the distant burial ground. The sight filled her with a peculiar sense of completion, as if she had successfully concluded some elaborate artistic endeavour. Spring brought new opportunities as the hospital's patient census increased with the warmer weather. Jane's reputation among the medical staff continued to grow, her dedication to patient care earning praise from physicians who had no suspicion of her true activities. She volunteered for the most difficult cases, those involving terminal patients or complicated surgical recoveries, situations where death was always a possibility and rarely questioned when it occurred. Her sixth hospital victim was a young man named Patrick Delaney, barely 25 years old, and admitted for treatment of tuberculosis that had advanced to his lungs. The disease was considered incurable by the medical standards of the time, making Delaney's eventual death a foregone conclusion in the minds of the attending physicians. Jane saw an opportunity to accelerate that inevitable outcome, while simultaneously satisfying her growing need for the intimate experience of watching life ebb away beneath her hands. The morphine she administered to Delaney was combined with a small amount of chloral hydrate, creating a cocktail that would suppress breathing while maintaining the appearance of peaceful sleep. She spread the dosage across several nights, each injection bringing the young man deeper into unconsciousness, while his family maintained their vigil beside his bed. When death finally came, it appeared to be nothing more than the natural progression of his disease, his lungs finally succumbing to the ravages of consumption. The hospital's mortality rate during Jane's tenure remained within normal parameters for an institution treating seriously ill patients. Her careful selection of victims ensured that each death could be attributed to natural causes or complications from existing conditions. The attending physicians trusted their nursing staff implicitly, never questioning the professional competence of someone who demonstrated such obvious dedication to patient care. As summer approached, Jane's confidence in her abilities reached new heights. She had discovered that murder, when practiced with sufficient skill and patience, could be conducted with virtual impunity within the confines of a medical institution. The very environment that was supposed to preserve life provided perfect camouflage for her deadly activities, the presence of death being so commonplace that no one questioned its frequent occurrence. The warm evenings of June found Jane working the night shift with increased frequency, her pale figure moving through the darkened wards like a spirit of death clothed in starched white cotton. The gas lamps burned lower during these hours, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with each flicker of flame. In these shadows, Jane Toppan perfected her terrible craft, transforming the act of healing into something far more sinister, her gentle hands administering not comfort but the final, irrevocable sleep that would claim so many innocent souls before her reign of terror finally came to its inevitable end. Chapter 7. The Weight of Whispered Confessions. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Cambridge Hospital as October settled over Massachusetts like a shroud. The year 1895 brought with it a peculiar restlessness that seemed to permeate the very walls of the medical institution. Jane Toppan moved through the corridors with her characteristic purposeful stride, her starched white uniform crisp despite the humid evening air that clung to everything within the building's confines. In Ward 7, Mrs. Elizabeth Brigham lay motionless beneath thin cotton sheets, her breathing shallow and laboured. The elderly woman had been admitted 3 days prior with what the attending physician had diagnosed as general weakness and failing constitution, ailments common enough among Boston's ageing population during the harsh New England seasons. What remained hidden from the medical records, however, was the careful administration of morphine sulfate that had begun almost immediately upon her arrival. Jane approached the bedside with measured steps, her leather shoes making barely a whisper against the polished wooden floors. The gaslight fixtures cast long shadows across the ward, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight that seemed to suit her nocturnal ministrations perfectly. She carried with her a small glass vial, its contents clear as mountain spring water, yet harbouring properties far more sinister than any healing remedy. The nurse had discovered, through careful experimentation over her years of service, that the precise combination of morphine and atropine could produce effects that fascinated her scientific curiosity. The morphine brought about a peaceful lethargy, while the atropine, extracted from belladonna plants she cultivated in her modest garden, created a peculiar state of consciousness that hovered between wakefulness and eternal sleep. Mrs. Brigham stirred slightly as Jane adjusted the thin pillow beneath her greying head. The patient's eyes, once bright with the vitality of 73 years of New England living, now held the clouded appearance that Jane had come to recognize as the penultimate stage of her careful process. The woman's lips moved soundlessly, perhaps forming the words of prayers learned in childhood, or calling out to family members who would never again hear her voice. The hospital's night supervisor, Mrs. Lucretia Davis, made her rounds with clockwork precision at past each hour. Jane had memorized this schedule months ago, timing her activities to occur during the lengthy intervals between inspections. The ward's other patients, 6 souls in various stages of recovery from surgical procedures or lingering illnesses, slept fitfully, their own medications administered at proper therapeutic doses that would genuinely aid their healing. As the rain intensified against the windows, Jane withdrew the small syringe from her nursing bag. The instrument, crafted of brass and steel, represented the pinnacle of modern medical technology. She had requisitioned it ostensibly for the administration of pain relief to surgical patients, a perfectly legitimate medical purpose that aroused no suspicion among her colleagues or supervisors. The morphine solution drew easily into the syringe's chamber, its clarity betraying nothing of its concentrated potency. Jane had calculated that Mrs. Brigham, given her advanced age and weakened constitution, would require approximately 4 grains to achieve the desired effect, nearly double the standard therapeutic dose for severe pain management. Mrs. Brigham's breathing grew more laboured as the medication took hold. Jane settled into the wooden chair beside the bed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching with clinical detachment as the patient's vital signs began their inevitable decline. The woman's pulse, which Jane monitored by placing her fingers against the thin wrist, slowed from its normal rhythm to something far more irregular and faint. The nurse found herself reflecting upon the peculiar satisfaction that accompanied these moments of transition. Medical professionals, she reasoned, were uniquely positioned to witness the boundary between life and death, a privilege afforded to few mortals. Yet most of her colleagues seemed to regard such encounters with solemnity or even distress, failing to appreciate the profound educational value inherent in observing the body's final processes. Through the ward's tall windows, the lights of Cambridge flickered like earthbound stars across the Massachusetts landscape. The city slept peacefully, its citizens secure in their beds, trusting in the healing power of modern medicine and the dedication of those sworn to preserve life. None could imagine that within the whitewashed walls of their most respected medical institution, death stalked the corridors wearing a nurse's cap and speaking in gentle, reassuring tones. Mrs. Brigham's breathing became increasingly shallow as the minutes passed. Jane noted with scientific interest how the patient's skin took on a peculiar pallor, almost luminescent in the gaslight's amber glow. The woman's fingers, once capable of needlework and letter writing, now lay motionless against the starched hospital sheets. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, creating a natural symphony that seemed to accompany the solemn proceedings within Ward 7. Jane found the sound oddly comforting, as though nature itself provided a fitting musical backdrop for these intimate moments of departure from earthly existence. At approximately 10 minutes past midnight, Mrs. Elizabeth Brigham drew her final breath. The transition occurred with such gentleness that Jane almost missed the precise moment when breathing ceased entirely. She waited several minutes before checking for a pulse. Finding none, then carefully arranged the deceased woman's hands in a position of peaceful repose. The death would be recorded as resulting from cardiac failure associated with advanced age and general constitutional weakness. Dr. Michael Brennan, the ward's attending physician, would sign the certificate without question, having observed Mrs. Brigham's declining condition during his previous examinations. No autopsy would be requested, as the cause of death appeared entirely consistent with the patient's medical history and presenting symptoms. Jane completed her documentation with meticulous care, noting the time of death as 12:20 in the morning and recording her own observations regarding the patient's final hours. Her handwriting, practiced and precise, revealed nothing of the true circumstances that had precipitated Mrs. Brigham's demise. The remaining patients in Ward 7 continued their restful sleep, undisturbed by the quiet drama that had unfolded in their midst. Jane drew the white sheet over Mrs. Brigham's face, transforming the elderly woman from patient to corpse with a simple gesture that held profound significance within the hospital's daily routines. As dawn approached, painting the eastern horizon with subtle shades of rose and gold, Jane prepared to complete her shift and return to her modest boarding house room. The night's activities had provided her with valuable insights into the precise timing required for her particular methodology. Mrs. Brigham had represented her 31st successful case study, each one contributing to her growing understanding of pharmaceutical effects on the human constitution. The morning supervisor would discover the deceased patient during the 6 o'clock rounds, initiating the standard procedures for handling deaths within the hospital setting. Undertakers would be contacted, family members notified, and the administrative paperwork completed with bureaucratic efficiency. Mrs. Brigham would be remembered as another elderly soul who had peacefully passed away while receiving the best medical care available in late 19th century Massachusetts. Jane gathered her nursing supplies, ensuring that nothing remained to suggest any deviation from standard medical protocols. The empty morphine vial would be disposed of through normal channels, along with other used medical materials. The syringe, thoroughly cleaned, would return to its designated storage location for future legitimate medical applications. Standing at the ward's entrance, Jane cast one final glance toward the bed where Mrs. Brigham lay beneath the pristine white sheet. The sight stirred within her a complex mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. Each successful case increased her confidence in her methods, while simultaneously intensifying her desire to expand her understanding of human physiology and the precise mechanisms of pharmaceutical intervention. The hospital corridors echoed with her footsteps as she made her way toward the staff exit. Cambridge Hospital would awaken to another ordinary day, its physicians and nurses continuing their noble work of healing the sick and comforting the afflicted. None would suspect that among their ranks walked someone whose definition of medical care had evolved beyond the conventional boundaries of therapeutic practice. Outside, the October morning brought with it the crisp freshness that characterized New England autumns. Jane breathed deeply of the clean air, feeling a sense of accomplishment that accompanied the successful completion of her nocturnal endeavors. The boarding house where she maintained her residence lay only a short walk through Cambridge's quiet residential streets, past modest wooden homes where families slept peacefully beneath handmade quilts and woolen blankets. As she walked, Jane contemplated the day ahead and the patients who would soon come under her care. Each one represented a potential opportunity for continued learning, though she maintained strict criteria for selecting appropriate subjects for her specialized studies. Age, constitution, family circumstances, and medical prognosis all factored into her careful calculations. The weight of accumulated knowledge pressed gently upon her consciousness as she approached her temporary home. 31 cases had provided her with unprecedented insights into the delicate balance between life and death, insights that she believed would eventually contribute to the advancement of medical science, though perhaps not in ways that her colleagues might immediately comprehend or appreciate. Dawn broke fully across Massachusetts as Jane Toppan climbed the wooden steps to her boarding house, carrying with her the secrets that would forever separate her from those who practiced medicine according to more conventional principles. Chapter 8. The web tightens around Cambridge. The autumn of 1901 brought with it a chill that seemed to settle deep into the bones of Cambridge Hospital. where the gas lamps cast their amber glow through corridors that had grown unnaturally quiet. The ward where Jane Toppan had once moved with such practised confidence now bore an atmosphere of unease, though few could articulate precisely why. The very air seemed to hold whispers of suspicion, carried on the evening breeze that rattled the tall windows overlooking the Charles River. In the administrative offices, Dr. Frank Hobson sat hunched over his ledgers, the brass buttons of his waistcoat catching the lamplight as he traced columns of figures with his finger. The mortality statistics for the past months painted a picture that defied medical explanation. Patients who should have recovered under standard treatment had instead succumbed to mysterious complications. The pattern was subtle, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, but to Hobson's trained eye, it spoke of something far more sinister than mere medical misfortune. The scent of pipe tobacco mingled with the ever-present carbolic acid as Hobson reached for his correspondence. Letters from concerned families, inquiries from other medical institutions, and reports from supervising nurses had begun to accumulate like autumn leaves, each one adding another piece to a puzzle that grew more disturbing with each passing day. The hospital's reputation, built carefully over decades of faithful service to the community, now hung in the balance as whispers began to spread through the medical circles of Boston. Meanwhile, in her modest boarding house on Cambridge Street, Jane Toppan moved through her evening routine with the same methodical precision she had once applied to her nursing duties. The small room, with its faded wallpaper depicting pastoral scenes and its single window overlooking the gaslit street below, had become her sanctuary in these uncertain times. She arranged her few possessions with careful attention, each item placed exactly where it belonged, as if maintaining perfect order in her personal space could somehow ward off the chaos that threatened to engulf her carefully constructed world. The dismissal from Cambridge Hospital had come without warning, though Jane had sensed the shifting currents of suspicion that flowed through the ward like an invisible tide. The official reason given was a reduction in staff due to budgetary constraints, but the timing coincided too closely with certain investigations to be mere coincidence. Dr. Hobson's questions had grown more pointed, his observations more penetrating, and the other nurses had begun to watch her with eyes that held uncomfortable speculation. As the clock on her mantelpiece chimed the hour, Jane reflected on the cruel irony of her situation. She, who had devoted herself so completely to the art of healing, who had sacrificed her youth and beauty in service to the suffering, now found herself cast out like a common criminal. The morphine and atropine that had once been her tools of mercy were now viewed with suspicion, their legitimate medical applications overshadowed by darker possibilities that lurked in the minds of those who had never truly understood her calling. The gaslight from the street below painted shifting patterns across her ceiling as carriages passed in the night, their wheels clattering against the cobblestones with a rhythm that matched her restless thoughts. In the distance, the bells of Harvard College tolled the passing hours, marking time in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to those who possessed the courage to ease suffering in ways that conventional medicine could not comprehend. Letters from former patients' families had begun to arrive with troubling frequency, their tone shifting from gratitude to questioning, from warm remembrance to cold suspicion. Mrs. Gordon's daughter wrote asking pointed questions about her mother's final days, while the Gibbs family demanded a full accounting of the medications administered during their patriarch's last illness. Each inquiry felt like a tightening noose, though Jane maintained her composure with the same steely resolve that had served her throughout her nursing career. The autumn rains drummed steadily against her window, creating rivulets that caught and scattered the gaslight in patterns that reminded her of tears. In these quiet moments, surrounded by the familiar comforts of her modest quarters, Jane allowed herself to contemplate the injustice of her position. She had dedicated her life to alleviating pain, to providing comfort in humanity's darkest hours, yet now she found herself pursued by those who could not appreciate the depths of her compassion. The medical establishment, with its rigid protocols and limited understanding, had never fully grasped the art of her practice. While other nurses administered medications with mechanical precision, following doctor's orders without question or innovation, Jane had always understood that true healing required a more intuitive approach. The slight adjustments to dosages, the careful timing of treatments, the gentle guidance of souls from suffering to peace. These were skills that could not be taught in any nursing school or medical college. As October deepened into November, the investigations into the unusual mortality patterns at Cambridge Hospital began to intensify. Police Superintendent John Levitt, a man whose weathered face spoke of decades spent pursuing truth through the darkest corners of human nature, found himself drawn into a case unlike any he had encountered in his long career. The possibility that a trusted member of the medical profession might be responsible for the very deaths she was sworn to prevent challenged his fundamental understanding of human nature. The superintendent's office, located in the heart of Cambridge's civic district, became a hub of quiet activity as investigators pieced together the complex web of circumstances surrounding the suspicious deaths. Gas lamps burned late into the evening as clerks transcribed witness statements and medical experts pored over hospital records, searching for patterns that might reveal the truth behind the mounting casualties. Dr. Leonard Wood, the coroner whose responsibility it was to determine the cause of death in questionable cases, found himself facing a challenge that tested the limits of forensic medicine. The symptoms described by witnesses, the sudden onset of respiratory distress, the peculiar pallor that preceded death, the strange serenity that seemed to overtake patients in their final moments, suggested the presence of substances that left few traces in the body after death. The primitive state of toxicological analysis in 1901 meant that proving poisoning required more than scientific evidence. It demanded a careful reconstruction of opportunity, means, and motive that could satisfy both medical professionals and legal authorities. The delicate alkaloids that Jane had learned to manipulate with such precision were ghost-like in their effects, leaving behind only whispers of their presence that required the most sensitive detection methods available. In the hospital itself, the remaining nursing staff found themselves under unprecedented scrutiny. Every medication they administered was double-checked, every patient death was subjected to intensive review, and the atmosphere of trust that had once characterized the institution gave way to one of watchful suspicion. The very nature of medical care, built upon faith in the healing profession, seemed to have been poisoned by the growing awareness that death might have walked among them wearing the white uniform of mercy. Matron Sarah Connors, whose stern demeanour had maintained order in the ward for over 20 years, found herself grappling with the possibility that her judgment of character had been catastrophically flawed. She had trusted Jane Toppan, had even admired her dedication to patient care, and now that trust appeared to have been not merely misplaced but potentially deadly. The weight of this realization settled upon her shoulders like a lead cloak, growing heavier with each passing day. The hospital's trustees, pillars of Cambridge society whose reputations were intimately tied to the institution's standing, convened in emergency sessions to address the crisis. Their mahogany-panelled boardroom, with its portraits of distinguished founders gazing down from gilded frames, became a war room where strategies were developed to protect both the hospital's mission and its public standing. The delicate balance between cooperation with investigations and preservation of institutional integrity required the most careful navigation. As winter approached, bringing with it shorter days and longer nights, the investigation took on an urgency that matched the season's gathering darkness. Witnesses were interviewed and re-interviewed, medical records were subjected to minute examination, and the complex web of relationships within the hospital was mapped with painstaking precision. Each thread of evidence was carefully preserved and analysed, building toward a conclusion that few wanted to accept, but many were beginning to find inevitable. The broader medical community watched these developments with a mixture of fascination and horror. Professional journals began to publish articles about the safeguards necessary to prevent such tragedies, while medical schools incorporated new protocols designed to ensure that the healing arts could never again be perverted to serve such dark purposes. The case promised to reshape the very foundations of medical practice, transforming the relationship between healers and patients in ways that would echo through generations. Through it all, Jane Toppan maintained the outward composure that had served her so well throughout her career. She answered questions when asked, provided documentation when requested, and continued to present herself as a dedicated professional whose only crime had been caring too deeply for her patients' welfare. Yet beneath this carefully maintained facade, she could feel the walls closing in, the web of evidence tightening with each passing day, drawing her ever closer to a reckoning that would determine not only her fate, but the future of medical practice itself. The chapter closed with the approaching winter of 1901, as investigations continued and suspicions deepened, setting the stage for revelations that would shock not only Cambridge, but the entire medical establishment of New England. Chapter 9. The web grows tighter. The autumn of 1901 settled over Cambridge like a shroud, its cold fingers reaching through the hospital windows where Jane Toppan continued her deadly ministrations. The leaves outside turned gold and crimson before falling to earth, much like the patients under her care who would never see another spring. The rhythm of death had become as natural to her as breathing, each calculated dose of morphine or atropine a note in a symphony only she could hear. Within the sterile corridors of Cambridge Hospital, whispers began to circulate among the staff. Dr. Leonard Wood, the chief physician, found himself studying mortality rates with growing unease. The numbers told a story he was reluctant to believe, yet could no longer ignore. In the wards where Nurse Toppan worked, patients died with troubling frequency, often showing symptoms that defied conventional medical understanding. The gaslight cast long shadows across Wood's office as he pored over patient records deep into the night. Mrs. Elizabeth Brigham, admitted for minor surgery, had expired suddenly during what should have been routine recovery. Mr. Timothy O'Brien, recovering from pneumonia, had taken an unexpected turn and passed away just hours after Nurse Toppan's evening rounds. The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room, revealing a truth too horrifying to comprehend. Jane moved through these same corridors with practiced serenity, her starched uniform pristine despite the chaos she sowed. The other nurses regarded her with a mixture of admiration and puzzlement. How did she manage to remain so composed when death visited her patients so frequently? They attributed it to her years of experience, her supposed dedication to the healing arts. None suspected that death did not simply visit Jane Toppan's patients. She invited it in, welcomed it, orchestrated its arrival with the precision of a conductor directing an orchestra. The morphine vials in the hospital's medicine cabinet seemed to empty with unusual rapidity. The head pharmacist, Mr. Charles Whitman, noticed the discrepancy during his weekly inventory. Morphine sulfate, atropine, and digitalis. All powerful substances that could heal in proper doses or kill when administered with malicious intent. The records showed these medications being dispensed to various wards, yet the consumption pattern seemed inconsistent with normal medical practice. In the private homes of Boston's affluent families, Jane had established herself as the most sought-after private nurse in the city. Her reputation preceded her like a calling card edged in black. The wealthy matrons of Beacon Hill spoke her name in hushed, reverent tones, praising her dedication to their loved ones during their final hours. They did not know that those final hours were often far fewer than nature had intended. Mrs. Myra Connors, wife of a prosperous merchant, had hired Jane to care for her elderly mother during what appeared to be her last illness. The old woman, though frail, had shown signs of improvement under Jane's initial care. Yet as the days passed, her condition inexplicably deteriorated. Jane sat by her bedside through the long nights, administering what she claimed were prescribed medications, watching with clinical fascination as the morphine worked its way through the woman's system. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the Connors mansion as Jane prepared another dose. The household slept peacefully, trusting in their hired nurse's competence. In the amber glow of the bedside lamp, Jane's face wore an expression of almost maternal tenderness as she approached her patient. The old woman's eyes fluttered open, meeting Jane's gaze with a mixture of gratitude and growing confusion as consciousness began to slip away. By morning, Mrs. Connors would find her mother at peace, her suffering finally ended. Jane would accept the family's tearful thanks and their generous payment, already anticipating her next assignment. The cycle had become as natural as the changing seasons, each death a small victory in a war only she understood she was fighting. Dr. Wood's investigation continued in the shadows of official inquiry. He had begun keeping his own records, documenting every patient death that occurred during Jane's shifts. The correlation was undeniable, yet proving deliberate harm remained nearly impossible. The symptoms her patients exhibited, respiratory depression, cardiac irregularities, sudden collapse, could easily be attributed to their underlying conditions or the natural progression of their illnesses. The medical knowledge of the era worked in Jane's favour. Toxicology was still in its infancy, and the sophisticated tests that might reveal her methods did not exist. Morphine poisoning could masquerade as heart failure. Atropine overdose might appear to be a stroke. The very medication she used to kill were the same ones employed legitimately to ease suffering, making her crimes nearly invisible to contemporary medical understanding. Jane's personal life during this period remained carefully compartmentalized. She maintained a modest apartment near the hospital, furnished with simple, practical items that revealed nothing of her true nature. Her neighbours knew her as a quiet, dedicated nurse who worked long hours caring for the sick. They sometimes heard her returning late at night, her footsteps soft on the wooden stairs, never suspecting that she carried the weight of multiple murders in her medical bag. The psychological gratification Jane derived from her actions had evolved beyond the initial thrill of power over life and death. Each successful poisoning reinforced her sense of superiority over her colleagues and society at large. She walked among them as a predator disguised as a healer, her very presence a mockery of the trust placed in her profession. The irony pleased her immensely, that those who sought healing from her hands instead found death. The Boston newspapers of late 1901 began carrying obituaries with increasing frequency, particularly noting the unfortunate deaths of several prominent citizens under the care of private nurses. The articles praised the dedication of these medical professionals who stayed by their patients' sides through their final struggles. Jane read these tributes with particular interest, noting when her own work was mentioned, savouring the unwitting praise for her murderous efficiency. As winter approached, Dr. Wood made a decision that would ultimately seal Jane's fate. He began working with a colleague at Massachusetts General Hospital, Dr. Francis Weld, to develop a more systematic approach to investigating suspicious deaths. The two physicians met in clandestine sessions, sharing their concerns and comparing notes on patterns they had observed. Their collaboration represented the first serious threat to Jane's reign of terror, though she remained unaware of their activities. The cold December air carried the scent of snow as Jane walked the streets of Boston, her black medical bag swinging gently at her side. Inside were the tools of her trade, syringes, vials, and small bottles containing substances that could bring either relief or death depending on her intentions. The city around her pulsed with life, its citizens going about their daily business, unaware that a killer moved among them wearing the uniform of mercy. At Cambridge Hospital, the night shift nurses had begun to notice subtle changes in their colleagues' behaviour. Jane seemed more withdrawn, her conversations limited to professional necessities. Some attributed this to the strain of losing so many patients, not realising that each death had been a calculated achievement rather than a professional failure. The isolation suited Jane perfectly, allowing her to plan her next moves without interference from well-meaning colleagues. The morphine in her possession had become like a faithful companion, its effects as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. She understood precisely how much to administer to achieve different outcomes. A small dose to create dependency, a larger one to cause stupor, and the final, massive quantity that would end all suffering permanently. This knowledge made her feel godlike, holding the power of life and death in measured doses. Winter settled over Massachusetts with unusual severity. The snow piling high against the windows of the hospital where Jane continued her work. The cold seemed to seep into the very bones of the building, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight that matched her increasingly dark mood. The thrill of her crimes had begun to demand ever more daring acts, pushing her toward risks that would ultimately prove her undoing. As 1901 drew to a close, Jane Toppan stood at the pinnacle of her murderous career, her reputation as a skilled and compassionate nurse firmly established throughout Boston's medical community. The web of death she had woven around herself grew tighter with each passing day, drawing her inexorably toward the moment when her carefully constructed facade would finally crumble, revealing the monster that had hidden beneath the starched white uniform of healing. Chapter 10. The Weight of Silence. The courtroom in Cambridge fell into profound stillness as Judge Mason's gavel struck its final blow on that cold February morning in 1902. The winter light filtered through tall windows, casting pale rectangles across the polished wooden floors where Jane Toppan had stood moments before, her hands folded with the same composure she had maintained through 43 years of calculated deception. The verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity echoed through the chamber like the tolling of distant church bells, sealing a fate that would remove her from society's reach, but never from its memory. The spectators who had filled every available seat during the sensational trial began to file out slowly, their whispered conversations carrying fragments of disbelief and morbid fascination. Newspaper correspondents clutched their notebooks, already composing headlines that would spread across the nation's breakfast tables by evening. The Angel of Death, they had called her, in their inflammatory prose, though none who truly understood the methodical nature of her crimes found anything angelic in her actions. Jane herself displayed no visible emotion as the court officers approached to escort her from the defendant's table. Her grey woolen dress, modest and unremarkable, gave no hint of the horrors that had unfolded beneath her careful ministrations. The same hands that had held morphine vials with deadly precision now smoothed her skirts with practiced gentility. Her pale blue eyes, which had watched life drain from 31 souls with clinical fascination, gazed forward with apparent serenity as she was led from the courtroom for the final time. The journey to Taunton State Hospital began that very afternoon, under a pewter sky heavy with unspent snow. The carriage wheels turned steadily along the frozen roads, carrying Jane Toppan away from the world she had manipulated with such deadly skill. The bare branches of winter maples scratched against the leaden heavens, their skeletal forms reaching toward clouds that promised no absolution. Inside the enclosed conveyance she sat with the same unnatural calm that had characterized her demeanor throughout the trial, her breathing steady, her pulse measured, as if the revelation of her crimes had lifted some tremendous burden from her shoulders. The hospital's brick facade emerged from the February gloom like a fortress of forgotten souls. Built in the Gothic Revival style favoured for institutions of its kind, Taunton State Hospital stretched across the Massachusetts landscape with an imposing mixture of therapeutic intention and architectural severity. Its tall windows, barred but not unkind, reflected the dying light of that winter day as the carriage drew to its final stop. The building had been designed to house those whom society deemed incapable of rational thought, yet within its walls would dwell a mind that had rationalized murder with chilling precision. Dr. Stedman, the hospital superintendent, waited in the administrative wing as Jane Toppan was formally admitted to the institution that would contain her for the remainder of her natural life. The paperwork bore her true name, Honora Kelly. though the world had come to know her by the identity she had crafted with such meticulous care. The transformation from Irish immigrant's daughter to respectable nurse had taken decades to accomplish. The reduction to patient file required only the stroke of a pen across official documents sealed with the Commonwealth's authority. Her assigned quarters occupied a corner room on the hospital's 3rd floor, where winter light entered through windows that offered views of the surrounding countryside. The furnished space held simple necessities: an iron bed frame with clean linens, a wooden chair positioned near the window, a small table bearing a ceramic wash basin and pitcher. The walls, painted in institutional white, would witness the passage of seasons and years as Jane Toppan settled into the rhythm of confinement that would define her remaining days. The other patients at Taunton State Hospital represented the full spectrum of mental ailments recognised by early 20th century medicine. Some wandered the corridors in various states of confusion or distress, their minds lost to conditions that defied contemporary understanding. Others maintained lucid conversations while harbouring delusions that shaped their perception of reality in fundamental ways. Among them moved Jane Toppan, neither obviously disturbed nor entirely well, her presence adding an element of calculated normalcy to the institutional atmosphere. Dr. Stedman observed her carefully during those early weeks of February and March, noting her cooperative demeanour and apparent adjustment to hospital routines. She attended meals punctually, participated in prescribed activities without resistance, and engaged other patients in conversations that revealed no hint of the darkness that had consumed her previous existence. The nursing skills that had once facilitated murder now manifested in small acts of assistance to fellow patients, though the medical staff maintained constant vigilance against any opportunity for her to access substances that might prove harmful in her experienced hands. Spring arrived at Taunton State Hospital with the gradual warming of New England earth and the tentative emergence of green shoots in the institution's gardens. Jane Toppan established a routine of walking the grounds during permitted hours, her steps measured and deliberate as she traced paths between flowering beds that patients were encouraged to tend as therapeutic occupation. The hospital's philosophy emphasized the healing power of productive work and natural beauty, concepts that seemed to resonate with a woman who had once found purpose in activities far removed from healing. The seasons turned with mechanical regularity as Jane Toppan's life settled into patterns that would persist for decades within Taunton's protective walls. Summer brought humid heat that made the hospital's brick corridors oppressive, while autumn painted the surrounding maples in brilliant reds and golds that she observed through barred windows. Winter returned with its familiar severity, covering the landscape in snow that muffled sound and transformed the institutional grounds into scenes of stark beauty. Letters arrived occasionally from distant relatives or former acquaintances, though their frequency diminished as years passed, and the notorious Nurse Toppan faded from immediate public memory. She read these correspondences without visible emotion, folding them carefully before placing them in a small wooden box that contained the limited personal possessions permitted within the hospital's regulations. The outside world continued its progress through technological advancement and social change, but Jane Toppan's existence remained suspended in the timeless routine of institutional life. Dr. Stedman retired after many years of service, replaced by younger physicians who brought new theories about mental illness and therapeutic intervention. Jane Toppan adapted to each transition with the same cooperative demeanour that had characterised her initial admission, neither seeking special treatment nor causing disciplinary difficulties. The hospital's records documented a model patient whose past crimes seemed increasingly disconnected from her present reality, though the medical staff never forgot the calculated nature of the acts that had brought her to their care. The Great War came and went, its distant thunder barely disturbing the peaceful isolation of Taunton State Hospital. Younger patients arrived bearing the psychological wounds of modern warfare, their traumatic symptoms requiring different approaches than those applied to more traditional forms of mental disturbance. Jane Toppan, now entering her 6th decade of life, observed these developments with the detached interest of someone whose own battles had been fought in hospital wards and private homes, using weapons more subtle than artillery shells or poison gas. Her hair, once carefully maintained in the fashionable styles favoured by professional nurses, gradually whitened to match the institutional walls that had bounded her existence for more than 2 decades. The years had softened her features without diminishing the peculiar intelligence that flickered behind pale blue eyes, an intelligence that had once calculated precise dosages of morphine and atropine with deadly accuracy. Now that same analytical mind applied itself to hospital routines and the changing patterns of light that marked each day's passage from dawn to dusk. The 1920s brought new administrators and evolving theories about mental health treatment, but Jane Toppan remained a constant presence in the hospital's daily rhythm. Younger staff members knew her primarily as a long-term patient, whose case history mentioned nursing background and legal commitment following some unspecified criminal behaviour. The specific details of 31 calculated murders had faded into institutional memory, replaced by decades of unremarkable conduct that suggested successful containment rather than therapeutic cure. October arrived in 1938 with unusual warmth that prolonged the autumn season beyond its customary duration. Jane Toppan, now 79 years old, continued her daily walks through hospital grounds where maple trees displayed their final burst of colour before winter's approach. Her steps had grown slower but remained steady, carrying her along familiar paths she had traced thousands of times during nearly 4 decades of confinement. The woman, who had once moved through Cambridge Hospital's wards with deadly purpose, now moved with the measured pace of extreme age, her energy focused on the simple act of placing one foot before another. The evening of October 17th found her seated in her corner room as twilight settled across the Massachusetts landscape. Through barred windows she could observe the last golden light fading behind bare branches that etched intricate patterns against the darkening sky. Her breathing had grown laboured during recent weeks, each inhalation requiring conscious effort that reminded her of patients she had once watched struggle against pharmaceutical restraints. The irony was not lost on a mind that retained its fundamental clarity, despite the body's gradual surrender to mortality's inevitable claim. Dr. Harrison, the hospital's current superintendent, made his evening rounds with the same professional attention that his predecessors had maintained throughout Jane Toppan's long residency. He found her sitting calmly by the window, her hands folded in her lap with characteristic composure, her gaze fixed on the gathering darkness beyond the glass. When he inquired about her comfort, she responded with the same polite cooperation that had marked 40 years of institutional life, neither requesting assistance nor expressing distress at the obvious approach of her final transition. The night passed quietly in the corner room where Jane Toppan had spent more than half her adult existence. Hospital attendants maintained their regular checks, noting her peaceful demeanour and stable condition, despite the gradual weakening that had become evident during recent months. Dawn approached with the pale light of autumn morning filtering through familiar windows, illuminating a figure that had remained motionless since the previous evening's final rounds. Dr. Harrison confirmed the obvious conclusion when morning staff discovered Jane Toppan had passed sometime during the dark hours before dawn. Her features bore the same serene expression that had characterized her waking hours, as if death had arrived as quietly and methodically as she had once approached her victims' bedsides. The official cause was listed as heart failure, a diagnosis that revealed nothing of the calculated cruelty that had defined her most notorious years, or the decades of enforced tranquility that had followed. The funeral arrangements reflected her status as a long-term institutional patient, without surviving family members capable of claiming responsibility for her remains. A simple service was conducted at the hospital's chapel, attended by staff members who had known her during her final years, and a handful of patients whose mental conditions permitted participation in such solemn observances. The wooden coffin, plain but respectably constructed, contained the mortal form of a woman whose name had once filled newspaper headlines and courtroom galleries with horrified fascination, Burial took place in the hospital's cemetery, where weathered headstones mark the final resting places of forgotten souls who had ended their earthly journeys within Taunton's protective walls. Jane Toppan's grave received a simple marker bearing her legal name and the dates that bracketed her existence, 1857 to 1938. No inscription mentioned her nursing career or the crimes that had brought her to institutional confinement, leaving future visitors to wonder about the circumstances that had led to her presence among the hospital's permanent residents. The records of her 40-year confinement were filed in the hospital's archives, joining thousands of case histories that documented the intersection between mental illness and criminal behaviour during an era when such connections were poorly understood. Her story became part of the institutional memory that shaped subsequent policies regarding patients whose past actions had demonstrated capacity for calculated harm, though the specific details gradually faded into the administrative routine that governed such establishments. The seasons continued their eternal rotation around the hospital grounds where Jane Toppan had spent her final decades. Spring flowers bloomed in gardens she had once tended, summer heat oppressed corridors she had walked daily, autumn painted maples she had watched through barred windows, and winter snow-covered pathways her feet had traced countless times during 4 decades of measured captivity. The building itself remained unchanged, its Gothic revival architecture continuing to house those whom society deemed incapable of safe participation in ordinary existence. The candle burned low in memory's chamber, its flickering light casting final shadows across the pages of a story that had begun with immigrant dreams and concluded with institutional silence. The ward fell quiet as history turned another page in the darkness, leaving only whispered legends of the nurse who had transformed healing into harvest, care into calculation, and mercy into the methodical administration of death. In the stillness that followed, even the echo of her footsteps faded into the timeless rhythm of seasons turning, patients arriving, and the endless cycle of human frailty seeking shelter within walls built to contain what society cannot comprehend or cure.